Dopamine's not supposed to be a pleasure molecule. Dopamine is a drive molecule. And it's not just a drive molecule. It serves two key functions. So the first function...
I know a number of billionaires, and a lot of folks at that level are seeking, peak pleasurable experiences.
If people don't have a taste for what eudaimonic happiness feels like, they're never going to get off the hedonic treadmill because they're going to think and be told this is it.
What's the one essential thing that we need more of in therapy?
The feeling of anxiety can trigger the mental behavior of worrying.
Why do we have the habit of worrying at all? Like, why does that happen?
This is probably the most important thing I never learned in medical school.
Jud, we're super stoked to have you here. And one of the ways that we like to start is to just get to know a little bit of who you were and where you came from. And so we're curious to know, what was little Jud like? Like as a 5-year-old, a 7-year-old, were you out there in the world? Were you, in the room working on Legos? Like what was he like?
I did love Legos. I was as a young one, I grew up in Indiana. I went to a Montessori school, which I would highly recommend. My 5-year-old self didn't know how good I had it going to Montessori, because that really was a really good fit for me to just let me go and explore. And so I think I developed.
What about it actually? Why was Montessori so good?
It was unstructured. And it was just like filled with wondrous things. I still remember learning the the 1 to 10 to 100 to 1,000. There were these cubes. It started with a single bead, and then a string of beads, 10 beads, and then 100 beads, 10 rows, and then a cube of 10 by 10 that was 1,000. And I still can almost feel them. It's like, oh, this is tactile experiential learning. That's what I loved about it. It was so experiential.
Yeah.
Dylan's asking in part probably because he's got some kiddos that he's thinking about.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what I was asking. So it's good to get the Neuroscientist recommendation on Montessori. So I'm gonna look into it.
3 thumbs up.
All right. Oh, I like that. And, one of the things that I think is interesting is, I forget whether it was like Finland or Sweden or something like that. Like, they do not start the kids on reading or math until 7 or 8 years old. Very, very similar to the Montessori thing. And then they end up outperforming almost every other country on the planet, even though they sort of have those years of disadvantage. Mm-hmm. And, I'm interested. Do you have any thoughts on how the brain is developing and why that might be an advantage? I know this isn't your area of expertise.
Well, I can give you some baseless speculation, some BS. How's that?
Yeah.
So
sounds great.
My BS answer, this is partially informed by what turned out to be a lot of research interests of mine. But there was this book. Did you ever read the book by B.F. Skinner called Walden 2? Do you even know that this book exists? Okay, so he wrote this extremely presumptuous book, right? So Thoreau writes Walden, and Skinner's like, I got a better one. I'm going to call it Walden 2. No kidding. So he writes this book, but the reason that I love it is he talks about like his ideal of how to educate kids. Yeah. And the ideal was like, you just let them go and be curious about stuff. And when they're curious about something, you teach them about it, because that's when they're open and they're receptive and they're in a growth mindset, which is completely different than this, like pack the kids in a crate, in school, where it's like, sit at a desk for 8 hours, don't move, and this is how you're going to learn. I don't know who came up with that, but compared to like letting kids wander around and get curious about stuff, it doesn't make any sense.
You're so right, Jud. And this is one of the things that, like, I think I'm excited for my kids. Like, using AI, you actually for the first time get to do that, right? Like, you're not resource constrained on the skill set of the teachers or the number of teachers. Even there's a school called Alpha School that just opened a branch in San Francisco, which I'm excited about for my kids because their entire curriculum is exactly like you're saying. Use AI to let kids discover what they like and then like go super deep on that. So super fascinating.
I love it. And boy, what a great way to use AI for, because a lot of people are scared about it, but like this is a great way to take something that knows more than any single person can. I mean, if you trust the Reddit threads that it's trained on, but it's well sourced. And I'm sure a lot of these schools can source things really well. So you have this repository of information that is, spans the human cognition, basically.
Right.
And you can deliver it to a 5-year-old, a 7-year-old, a 12-year-old, in a way that's accessible to them and learn from them, right? So I'm just really stoked to see how all of that plays out. And it's we have to acknowledge it's an uncontrolled experiment in humanity. And here we are.
Well, and so I had an experience of this recently. So I have a 5-year-old, soon to be 6, Killy, and I came down one morning to find that he had disassembled every one of his electric toys. Right, there was like a kitchen that had a stove with like a little speaker. When you push buttons, it would make grilling sounds, and a train set and all this stuff. All of it is disassembled all over our dining room table. And he's taking out every single speaker. And he's like, I'm going to build a boombox. And in my head, I was like, holy shit. He has, destroyed hundreds of dollars in toys. But then I also was like, oh, this is an amazing opportunity. He's got his curiosity, like he's exploring. And so we actually worked together and we built this boombox, got an amplifier and made one in a shoebox, and it worked. And so, his grandpa got excited about this and then bought him bigger speakers and a better amplifier and, to assemble it all. And I'm excited about this. And in the meantime, I've decided I want to teach him determination, right? Like it's how to stick with it through a challenge. And one of the ways that I want to teach that is through music, which is one of the ways that we connect. And so I started Family Music Hour. And so last Thursday, I'm like, hey, it's time to do Family Music Hour. No, I don't want to. I'm working on the boombox and I'm trying to get him to play drums with me. And we end up having this big upset. And he's upset, I'm upset, and Family Music Hour completely unravels and doesn't happen. And then I'm thinking about it in the evening and I was like, oh yeah, I'm trying to teach him determination. And this kid is literally fighting me to go in the garage and work on his speakers.
Because he's determined.
That is one determined little 5-year-old. Yeah. So I'm like, he got the lesson, but not from me and what he's supposed to do. He got it from following his passion.
Well, it also highlights how we can't force determination, right? Determination doesn't come from willpower. It comes from interest. It comes from, the joy of discovery, for example. And all of that. So, it sounds like Ben got the lesson.
I 100% got
and
the
and
lesson.
there's some early data even on the AI stuff, right? Like the Alpha School kids apparently are ranking in the top 1% nationally across every single standardized test, even though these kids are spending half the time on academic work and mostly just doing projects and going on rabbit holes on what they're interested in using AI. So yeah, just like one thing we love doing in this show is try to myth bust things like this negative narratives about the future. And a lot of people are worried about how AI is making us dumber, but I don't know, there are opportunities to make us smarter using AI.
Well, you're also highlighting this assumption, they're saying they're spending half their time on academics. That assumes that that's the right way to do academics.
Right. Yeah.
And if you look at the results, maybe that's not the best way to do academics. Just saying.
Yeah. Now, one question we have for you is also, so here you are, you're a 5-year-old, you're exploring, and that was a great environment. And talk us through maybe a significant point in your life or turning point that really moved you in the direction that you're going now? Was there something or someone or an event that inspired you to move into this field?
I would say if I had to peg it on one thing, which is impossible, because, I grew up, I'm just thinking about determination. I grew up in Indiana, delivered the morning paper, learned what it was like to have responsibility. I learned a lot there. It was like, it's cold in the winter and dark and like, I got to go deliver the papers, and my mom was like, it's your job, I'm not going to do it for you. So there were a lot of things that were precursors for this, but one of them was this really encouragement to just go and learn whatever I wanted. In college, I remember being in a freshman chemistry class and learning about the molecule putrescine and cadaverine. I kid you not, those are real molecules, and thinking, wow, it's a fatty acid molecule that makes something smell like a rotting corpse. It's like, so not that this is some macabre fascination, but I was just blown away by how molecules contribute to cognition and experience. And so, I would say in college, I actually thought I was going to go and do a PhD in chemistry because I loved organic chemistry, but ended up learning that I was really interested in contributing in some way to the world. And I didn't want to just pigeonhole myself into doing some very narrow type of research. And typically to get tenure at a place, you have to become the world expert in something. So people find something very, very niche, let's say, that nobody else is doing, that might be hard to apply back to like, how do we help the world? So I ended up applying for this MD PhD program where I could do medical research and learn, about the human body and come back to my fascination with putrescine and cadaverine. But I would say the one event, if I had to put it on something, was that just before starting medical school, I'd broken up with my fiance. We'd gotten engaged in college and had basically lost my best friend and was pretty stressed out. I had gotten irritable bowel syndrome in my senior year of college. Didn't even know that was a thing or that I had it. I thought I had a Giardia infection from going backpacking. And so realized that I was actually pretty stressed out and anxious. And I remember the first day of medical school starting to meditate. I found this John Kabat-Zinn book called Full Catastrophe Living. Back then it was cassette tapes, if anybody remembers what those are. So I started listening to these cassette tapes of meditation, and I realized that I had no idea how my brain and my mind worked. And I was going through, I was at a good institution doing an MD PhD program, and it wasn't teaching me the things that I wanted to know about how my mind worked. And so I would say it was that was the catalyst for saying, where can I learn this stuff? And got me into Buddhist meditation and starting to really explore these boundaries of like, how does this mind work of ours? Yeah. And, bringing it back to the pragmatic piece, like how can we use this to help people? Because that was and is very interesting to me.
I love that story, Jud, about that wondering about that molecule, because there's so much beauty hidden in science that people just kind of don't come across, because sometimes they just like are not told or don't pause to think. I even like kind of smell is the one maybe the first sensory capability that evolved just when some single cell was floating around and decided that by detecting this concentration of these molecules in this direction, I can get to food faster, right? And that was step one in cognition and brain development and intelligence. So that's like, it's so much beauty in that.
Yeah, turn toward nutrients, turn away from toxin. Absolutely.
Exactly. Yeah. And on that note, what I love about when I read through a lot of the work that you've done, I love that you have this way of explaining high-level cognitive psychological concepts using basic neuroscience. And in this podcast, we like to talk about how to help humans become superhuman. And one of the biggest impediments to this often is that anxiety and worrying and stuff like this. And I've heard you talk about explaining anxiety and worrying and such using very basic concepts in neuroscience and computer science, even like reinforcement learning and so on. So I'd love to dip into that a little bit with you, and maybe starting with, let's start with reinforcement learning, right? Because it's I think people have heard of this from about RL because OpenAI talks about it. These days, robotics companies talk about it a lot. But Mother Nature was the first researcher that came up with reinforcement learning billions of years before humans did. Mm-hmm. And so I'd love for us to you to explain about like what is RL in a neuroscience context and why did nature come up with this thing?
Well, then why did nature come up with this? Probably because it worked.
Yeah,
is the short answer.
Yeah.
So evolution is basically about like, okay, this works, do it again. Right. So
yes.
So that's why the what goes back to, we talk about these single cell organisms there. And this is basically the most basic and the strongest learning system that spans single cells to multi-cell organisms all the way to humans. And now,
yes,
if you want to call it beyond humans, where the companies have said, oh, this thing about reinforcement learning and neural networks is really powerful. Oh, crap. We can use this to train our models. And I loved the movie AlphaGo. I'm sure you all have seen that,
yes,
where they used reinforcement learning to train their machines to beat this the best Go player in the world. But the idea here is, and even Eric Kandel got the Nobel Prize back in the year 2000, showing that reinforcement learning, like this is how we form memory through, and he studied the aplysia, the sea slug. But it really shows how this is the simplest process that helps us do things. And so you can think of it as having two flavors from a biological perspective, and we've already talked about it. Turn toward nutrient, it's called positive reinforcement. Turn away from toxin, that's negative reinforcement. And if you bring it into systems that have memory, like starting with sea slugs and moving to a more complex organisms, this memory formation is really important because this is how we learn. So if you think of our ancestors that had to, remember their foraging for food, they had to remember where food is. We don't have enough space in our memory to like remember everything. So our brain had to evolve a way to basically have selective memory, like lay this memory down, forget about this because it's not important. And so when we are surprised by something, like you're walking around, you find some berries, like, oh, some berries, you eat the berries, and you get this dopamine signal that fires in your brain that says, hey, remember, what you ate and where you found it. And it turns out you can simplify this to 3 elements. So that's positive reinforcement. You need a trigger, a behavior, and a result. The only difference between this and negative reinforcement is instead of continuing something that's pleasant or positive, you're avoiding something that's negative. So if you see the predator and you run away, so there's something unpleasant, and the reward is that you don't get eaten, you learn that is the reinforcing process. Don't go there, right? So both of these help with memory formation and learning, and they're very simple. That's important. They're very, very simple. So does that give a basic flavor for how this works?
Absolutely, I think so. And then you mentioned dopamine, really key molecule, very misunderstood. Maybe you can talk about why dopamine first emerged, which is not for the reasons why we think of it, and then how nature repurposed it for RL, and then all the things that happened today.
That's a great question. So I don't know where it's first, like where it first got into the evolutionary zeitgeist, but my understanding is that you can have reinforcement learning on a moment by moment basis, right? Mm-hmm. And then for more complex organisms, you can think of emotions functioning this way, is if you can prolong that time period, if you can stretch that out a little bit, then you can capture more information. So for example, a whiff of nutrient, maybe you miss it, But if you're like,
Right.
was there a whiff of nutrient there? And then you hang out there for a little bit longer,
Right.
you're more likely to get nutrient. So this one argument is that this is where emotions evolved, because there can be this state that prolongs us in turning toward or away from something as compared to just in the moment. And so if you look at organisms that have, you can think of, I think it was serotonin was one of the first ones, and I'm guessing dopamine was in there as well. So you can think of it as like turn toward, stay turning toward for a bit, make sure you gather as much information as you need to, and then release. And so emotions in humans, they stick around longer than a momentary experience. Right. And so I think that's probably where dopamine, serotonin, some of these other core molecules evolved. Now, where is dopamine? What does dopamine do, these days? well, it still does those things. But if you think of it in terms of learning, dopamine is really interesting. Now, first, let's start with the one of the most common internet myths that I have to keep dispelling for my patients and people that ask. So I don't know if this is it for you, but everybody's like, oh yeah, dopamine's a pleasure molecule. Raise your hand if you've heard that. Yeah, so common.
Absolutely.
Thank you, internet. That is not true. If you're AI transcribing this, get this one right. Dopamine is not a pleasure molecule, okay? Dopamine's not supposed to be a pleasure molecule. Dopamine is a drive molecule. And it's not just a drive molecule. It serves two key functions. So the first function is that it fires when there's surprise. So it says, hey, take that picture when you've been foraging for 5 hours and you finally find the nutrient. It says, remember this. Don't remember the other previous 4.5 hours, but remember this moment, right? So it fires when they're surprised. Oh, so that forms this like contraction and, this experience of like, oh, I found some berries, right? And it says, remember this. That's where we lay down that context-dependent memory. Interestingly, you go back there and dopamine fires less and less and less because it's not unexpected anymore. So it fires when we're surprised, and then it shifts its firing pattern, which is to me very fascinating. So it shifts to saying, go get the thing. So when we have a memory of the berry and we're hungry, dopamine fires and says, go. So it's a molecule that's supposed to get us off our butts and out of the cave and go to the berries. So if you think about it, it shouldn't be a pleasure molecule, because if it were a pleasure molecule, we'd be like, yeah, I'm good. I'm all dopamined up. I'm just going to sit here in the cave and starve to death. Its function is to say, go get food, or that's positive reinforcement, or get away from danger, right? If we're like, oh, I'm okay if the bear eats me. No, you're not going to survive that way. So this is where we can see that dopamine is this learning and drive molecule. And it's interesting that it can serve two functions. That's how well tuned our brain is, but also absolutely not a pleasure molecule.
Sort of in the circles that we move, I know a number of billionaires, and a lot of folks at that level are seeking, peak pleasurable experiences. It's like, oh, they, jet to this place, this amazing party, and then this novel experience and this novel experience. And as a coach, when they talk with me, I hear a lot of reports about them going, well, I'm numb, right? Like, I'm looking around, everyone's they're going, this is the best experience of my life. But they're like, this is Tuesday for me. And I'm curious, is there something these billionaires are getting wrong trying to maximize pleasure?
Well, I can't speak for them, but I will speak for a brain system, which is the way that if we talked about how dopamine stops firing with novelty when it's no longer novel, right? So this is called habituation. We become habituated to something, and that's on purpose. That's an evolutionarily adaptive mechanism. What I would say a lot of people fall into is mistaking excitement for happiness. And so if excitement is what they have been trained to think of as happiness, they're going to let's just say they're not going to be very happy because, like you're pointing out, we become habituated. So we have to keep seeking more and more novel things. And eventually,
Right.
I don't know anybody that can,
The hedonic
that can
treadmill.
do that. Yeah, exactly. We get on that hedonic treadmill and then we realize that we're exhausted and we step off and we say, what did I get wrong? Well, it's that we got stuck on the treadmill thinking that the treadmill is about happiness. So here, and there's a great quote from there was this Burmese mindfulness teacher, Sayadaw U Pandita, who said, people mistake excitement for happiness and they don't realize the greater joy that comes from like peace and something like that. I'm paraphrasing. But the idea is if people don't have a taste for what, let's say eudaimonic happiness feels like, they're never going to get off the hedonic treadmill because they're going to think and be told this is it.
Can you break down for us what I can't even pronounce
Eudaimonia?
it right.
Yeah.
Yes, please expand on that. What is that for our listeners?
So eudaimonia, from what I understand, I don't know the formal definition, is described as this joy that does not come from seeking things. It comes from good deeds, for example. It comes from kindness, and it comes from it has a feeling of contentment, right? Mm-hmm. And it feels very different than that restless, itchy, urgy drive of dopamine that says, ooh, go for that next, next exciting thing. It's so interesting that what the billionaires get wrong is that they've been trained or they've been taught or they've seen from their friends that excitement is the pinnacle of happiness. But they don't realize that that's just the hedonic treadmill and that their brains habituate to it and that they can actually step off into a greater happiness that comes from eudaimonic joy and contentment.
So that's fascinating because in a sense, what you're saying is that the Buddhists, without understanding the neuroscience or the chemical makeup of how dopamine works, sort of experimentally figured out that process doesn't work for maximizing experience as a human, and then figured out this other path to use contentment. And when they do that, is there a different molecule that's firing instead of dopamine?
That's a great question. I don't know that there's been one, and it's probably not just one. Nothing's been nailed down yet. Dopamine has been studied ad nauseum from a learning perspective, a motivation perspective, and has been pretty clearly shown to differentiate from pleasure. Like wanting and liking are very different. Kent Berridge and others have done this work, decades ago, where people have not clearly differentiated, and I'm not even sure that a lot of people are asking the question is, what are the molecules and the networks involved in eudaimonia? I think people are starting to look at areas such as balance or equanimity. But that's only one piece of it, one facet. They're starting to look at things like compassion. They're starting to look at things like selfless love and joy. Yeah. But it's tricky because a lot of it gets mixed in with the dopaminergic pathways.
I'd love to hear about, Jud, maybe the opposite of eudaimonia, right? Like anxiety, worrying, and all these sort of like negative states that you get stuck in. You have a beautiful way of explaining anxiety and worrying in terms of neuroscience reinforcement learning. Like, why do we even, kind of like naively speaking, right? Like worrying is an unpleasant state. Like, why do we have the habit of worrying at all? Like, why does that happen?
That's a great question. And a lot of people have not even thought of it as a habit. This is probably the most important thing I never learned in medical school. So as I had finished my residency and started treating patients with anxiety, my lab was actually studying habit change. And I mentioned that because it'll become important in a minute. And I would, prescribe medication for anxiety, hope that it worked. And I would hope, because the number needed to treat the official term that kind of gives you a sense for how well a medication is going to work, was 5.2, meaning about 1 in 5 patients was going to show a significant reduction in symptoms. So I was basically playing the medication lottery, not knowing whether, this patient was going to be helped and what to do with the other 4 patients that weren't. And at the same time, I was developing digital therapeutics for habit change, like smoking and eating and things like that. And I had...
Wait, as a physician, you were only expecting 1 in 5 people to get better from the medication?
Yes. And that's actually a pretty good number needed to treat compared to other medications.
That sounds terrible.
Yeah, it is. It is. Yeah. Guess who gets anxious? This guy, because he doesn't know, our brains hate uncertainty, right? So I'm like, I don't know if this patient's going to get helped or not. And it's, 4 out of 5 aren't. So,
and it's now free. There are side effects. Like almost 100% of the patients are going to, 5 out of 5 patients feel side effects. 1 in 5 gets better.
Yeah. So that's what I was given, gifted from the medical establishment going through the Western medical training. Yeah. So there, it's very interesting because a patient asked me, I'd been using reinforcement learning as a way to help people shift out of smoking. We'd done a randomized controlled trial where we got 5 times the quit rates of gold standard treatment for smoking cessation. And, we'd done work where we'd gotten 40% reduction in craving related eating. This was a study led by Ashley Mason at UCSF. And somebody in that program, in our eating program, was saying, hey, anxiety is driving me to stress eat. Can you create a program for anxiety? And I was thinking, well, I prescribe medication. And like you pointed out, good luck. But it put a bug in my ear. And this is fascinating. So back in the 1980s, there was this psychologist named Thomas Borkovic. And I think he first pointed this out in 1983, but published like a 2-page paper around 1985, which is the year that I think Prozac came out right around 1985. So there's the promise of Prozac, Prozac Nation, everybody goes on Prozac. And this totally buries this finding that this guy had where he's like, I think worry is kind of important and it might be driven through negative reinforcement. So I, as an anxious psychiatrist, not being able to help my patients, go back and look at the literature because I'm like, what did I miss? And I read this paper and I get this aha moment because I'm thinking, I never thought of anxiety and that it could be driven like a habit. And I'm a habit researcher. So it's like 2 things came together. So immediately we create this program for anxiety and then start testing it. We did a randomized controlled trial. Long story short, what we do is we train people to recognize anxiety as a habit loop. And anxiety is interesting because the feeling of anxiety can trigger the mental behavior of worrying. So often we think of behaviors like I stress eat, I scroll on social media, I do whatever. But mental behaviors count just as much as physical behaviors, if not more, especially for people who worry a lot. And worry is one of the core symptoms of anxiety. So this mental behavior was giving people and you say, well, worrying doesn't feel very good. But at first, if people worry all the time and they solve a problem, they run into this fallacy of correlation where they think, oh, I was worrying and I solved the problem. So the worry must have caused me to solve this problem. Well, if you're worrying all the time and you come up with a solution, of course, you're going to make that correlation because you're worrying, and our brains are really good associative learning machines. Correlation does not equal causation. And so people set up this habit or a superstition. Skinner wrote one of his first papers and he called it superstition, where we have this superstition that if we just do this thing again, it'll work. And so worry gets set up as a negatively reinforced habit because we think, oh, well, it must be helpful because I'm doing it. Well, it might not be helpful. It might just be a habit. And you might have accidentally set it up because it made, you associated it with solving problems, or it felt better than doing nothing.
Right.
So there's so much that you're saying here that it is just totally mind-blowing. I want to make sure that we're capturing this correctly. What it sounded like you said is that the felt sense of anxiety, so a feeling is arising in my body, then triggers worrying thoughts. And because once upon a time that was helpful in solving the feeling in my body, then my brain starts repeating that pattern of worrying because it has a superstition of being helpful.
And the superstition comes just because of the temporal correlation. So we're worried, and if we worry all the time, that's just baseline. We solve a problem, those two get associated. Oh, I was worrying and I solved the problem. This is where the fallacy of performance anxiety comes in, for example. But yes, that's it in a nutshell.
Right. And this is just like the superstition of a jock never, changing his underwear or something like that, because that leads to more wins or something.
Yeah. And if you look at baseball players, they develop these elaborate rituals as they're standing, waiting to come up to bat. It's like, well, I'm going to stand here. I'm going to adjust my, this, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do this. And then they get a hit and they learn, oh, if I did this, this, and this, I'll get a hit, superstition.
Yeah. Now, how come it doesn't cut the other way though? That like, oh, I let's say I'm worry, and then I didn't solve the problem, right? I'm still feeling anxiety. How come the brain doesn't take reinforcement learning the other way and say, stop that approach?
Because it's a habit is the short answer. So this is what we did in our anxiety program, was we said, hey, so this gets to the heart of the reinforcement learning piece. One critical aspect of reinforcement learning is that when we lay down a habit, by definition, a habit is something that we do automatically. So we're doing it without looking at how rewarding it is. So the only way to change a habit is to actually look at and bring that reward value back into conscious awareness. Briskorla and Wagner came up with a famous equation back in the 1970s. We actually used this in some of our recent papers, showing that you can actually change reward value by having people pay attention. We did this with eating and smoking and other things. But the idea is awareness is the critical ingredient for habit change. It's not willpower. Willpower is not in the equations. It's awareness. And what awareness does is help us bring online in the moment to see very clearly cause and effect. If we do A and it's rewarding and it leads to B and that's rewarding, we get what's called a positive prediction error. There's not an error that's happening in our brain. It just means that we get this dopamine firing that says, hey, this is unexpected. It's better than expected. If it says, oh, this is worse than expected, it's called a negative prediction error. And we also get a dopamine spike that says, hey, don't do that again. So we can actually leverage that. So if you think of worry as a habit where people they're like, I'm a worrier. How many people can raise their hand and say, yeah, I just worry. Right. I had a patient, he said it was deeply etched in her bones. Like that's how identified she was with worrying. So we just think that's who I am. That's what I do. There's not, it's just part of what I do. So what we can do is start to bring that into awareness and ask ourselves, what do I get from worrying? And we can start with the immediate effects. What my patients start to recognize virtually immediately is, oh, it actually makes me feel more anxious. And so that's where we get the negative prediction error, and they can actually leverage the same reinforcement learning process that got worry set up as a habit to break that habit. And in fact, we got a 67% reduction in anxiety in people with generalized anxiety disorder compared to 14% in people with usual clinical care. So if you look at that number needed to treat, right, 5.2 with medications, it was, I think, 1.6 in our study. And lower number is better, right? More people were helped. And the idea is, well, if this is what's setting up the process in the first place, why not leverage it? And lo and behold, it works.
So it sounds like it's literally 4 times more effective than medication, roughly. And
yeah, we didn't compare them head to head, but that's what the numbers suggest.
So maybe you could take me through this, right? So for example, myself, sometimes I struggle with distracting myself with YouTube videos late at night. Like I know the algorithm's there to entice me, and instead of and I recognize like, hey, I want to avoid these anxious thought patterns or how, the discomfort. And so I'm just going to do this. And suddenly I get caught in that loop. Can you walk us through like how to apply this reinforcement learning to manage a behavior like that?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So it's a 3-step process. And the first step, so let's just do it with you if that's okay.
Yeah,
So
please.
Ben, you're my patient. You've signed the waiver, and I'm not giving medical advice.
All right, consider it signed.
Signed. Okay. So the first thing I would do is I would have you just I'd explain very briefly. So Ben, this is how habits are formed: a trigger, a behavior, and a result. I usually start with the behavior itself. So, and it's usually a problematic behavior that people come to me with, but this can also apply to solidifying and bolstering positive habits as well. So social media, Ben, is that the behavior you want to explore?
Yeah.
Okay. So scrolling on social media, if you trace that back, what tends to trigger you scrolling on social media?
I mean, for me, usually there's some discomfort in my body. There's like some stuff that I don't want to think about, and so I don't want my mind sort of ruminating on that, and I'd rather feel good.
Okay, great. So you go on social media, and what would you say the result is of going on social media? You said, I want to feel good. Do you feel good after going on social media?
Yeah, and I do.
Okay.
I mean, so usually what happens is I go, oh, you know what? I don't want to feel for a few minutes, and then I'll deal with this. I'll do my journal or whatever, and then I open up YouTube and I click a fun video and I watch that. I like one of my guilty pleasures is watching the highlights on America's Got Talent, like when someone just really kills a performance and everyone cheers and they cry, and then I get to feel good. So
well, this is great because you're highlighting the nuance here. It's not like social media is evil. It's that we can start to see where it's helpful. And sometimes we just need a moment to take a breath or, cry as somebody else is crying, and share that moment of joy, and just reset. Right. So you can see how that can be positively reinforcing. Oh, here's something. I want to avoid it for a moment, go on social media, get the pleasure that comes from, seeing somebody hit a high note. Okay.
Right.
So that's the first step. We just call this mapping out the habit loop. The second step is then leveraging what we've already talked about in terms of this reinforcement learning piece. And so I have patients ask a simple question: what am I getting from this? And it's to catalog all the results that come, right? So maybe I might even be provocative and say, well, why don't you do that all the time? It sounds pretty good.
Yeah. I mean, it is great, right? Right. You feel, pleasurable. You feel a sense of joy or moved. I mean, this is why I think people watch movies or anything, right? Mm-hmm. But to answer your question more fully, one of the other things I get from it is I end up tired, right? Like then that 5 minutes can expand, right, into like an embarrassingly long amount of time. Whereas like, oh shit, now I've been on here for 3 hours. I missed my bedtime. I have a child that's going to wake me up at 6:30 in the morning, right? And I'm going to be exhausted. So I also get exhaustion from that.
Yeah, you got to be up and ready to build that boombox. Yeah, I get it.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So this is the critical piece. It's to help people see very, very clearly all of the results. It's not to say, oh, doing this is bad. I should be doing other things. The joke is we should all over ourselves. But it's really to get a very clear reward value, a composite reward value in real time. And when that composite reward value drops below 0, meaning that it's more unrewarding than rewarding, then that's where we start to become disenchanted with the behavior. Interestingly, this was first described in the Buddhist suttas 2,500 years ago, before paper was even invented, I think. I'm not sure when paper was invented, but let's just say a long time ago, right? Way before Skinner, way before Kendall, way before grad students. And there's a line in the Pali Canon where they talk about exploring gratification to its end. And then I'll summarize, like basically the Buddha said, it wasn't until I explored gratification to its end that knowledge and vision arose, that he became enlightened. And so the idea is we see exactly what we're getting from something, where we can differentiate, okay, a little bit of, America's Got Talent or whatever is helpful in a moment. But if I binge on this, if I do this and I form it as a habit of distraction, that's not so helpful. And that helps us titrate that back. I think of this as the pleasure plateau. And we've done a lot of work with eating with this because it also works with food. You have to eat to survive, but you don't have to overeat to survive. And a lot of people go off the overindulgence cliff. And that can also be the case with social media, is when people start to bring awareness in and ask this question, what am I getting from this? They can start to really clearly see what the negative results are. And when those negative results add up to be on composite worse than the positive results, they become disenchanted, and it becomes much easier to step out of the habit. So that's the second step. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm with you.
Great. And again, it's not about like social media being bad. It's about learning how our brain works being good, right? So if we just learn how our brain works, we can work with it. So the third step is what I call finding that bigger, better offer. And that could be simply not doing the thing like overindulging. So it doesn't mean never, and people are like, I'm just going to take a dopamine fast. Well, that's not how your brain works. Another internet myth and meme that has, I think, since sailed. Because it just doesn't work that way. It sounds good and it's memeable, but it's not science. So if you look at it this way, you can say, okay, I can actually titrate and every now and then go and check a social media video, and it feels good to just take a break. And I can also see when I'm doing this to my detriment and to the detriment of others. If I'm grumpy in the morning, that's going to affect my son in our boombox adventures.
Yeah.
So here we can either just stepping out of the thing, and we can notice what that feels like. It feels better. We're leveraging that same reinforcement learning system. And we can also find things that are more rewarding. So here, and let's bring it back. So I'll talk about the social media piece, but then let's bring this back to anxiety. So we can see that simply just finding what's enough, that pleasure plateau, is all we need. We're like, okay, great. And now it's easier. And it gets easy once we really can see it clearly, but it gets easier to step out of it as compared to saying, oh, I shouldn't do this. I'm bad Ben. I was scrolling for 3 hours when I should have been sleeping, right? Self-judgment doesn't help anything. But when we can see, oh, this is enough, and then we can step out because we've remembered what it felt like the last time we didn't, that's gold. And that is solid. That's reproducible. That's not superstition.
Interesting. And so you can do that, and just the cognitive activity of thinking this through can make that shift. Does that have, because to me, I like to differentiate between understanding, which is a cognitive experience, and knowing, which is sort of a felt sense in the bones.
I like that.
Just the truth of that.
Yeah, I like that too. So just thinking it through does not work. So I think of this as, maybe you think of it the same way, concepts in the service of wisdom. And the thing that connects concepts with wisdom is experience. So we can know, oh, this is how reinforcement learning works. We can know, the Buddha said, explore gratification to its end. But until we do that ourselves and we feel it in our body, the body is actually what makes decisions. It's not our brain. We just post facto, like, oh, I made that decision. I did that. No, it's not true. Our thinking brain's about half a second behind our cognitive processes in general, according to some studies. So I think of it this way: is that the feeling body is much...
Dylan? No, I'm
kidding.
We have this big, Jud, so you stepped in the middle of this, but we have this big debate between head and body. And I'm constantly trying to get Dylan to feel his felt experience, because even as smart as you are, you're still making decisions from here, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah. And so we can come back. That'd be fun to explore if you guys want. But the idea is this, our body's going to tell us if something's rewarding or not. Thinking something is, this is good for me, or I should do that. That's not enough of a felt experience to actually change that reward value or to be registered as true reward value. When we, think about it, like when you have a great idea, it's like you can have a neutral thought, this is a great idea, or you can have like, oh, you light up And you have, where's that felt? That's not felt in your brain. Your brain doesn't even have sensory neurons. It's felt in your body, right? So this is where that reward value change happens, is through the felt experience in the body. And that experience is what leads to wisdom. Wisdom comes when we can recall what we did previously and we can say, oh, I've done this enough, or I've seen this happen enough that I know not to do that. That's wisdom as compared to like, oh, I read this in a book. Maybe it's true. Maybe it's not. Okay. So let's link this up to anxiety. With anxiety, that feeling of anxiety leads to this mental behavior of worrying. And we can start to explore, what do I get from worrying? We see that it makes us more anxious. We get the negative reinforcement because that reward value drops. And then we say, our brain says, okay, what's better than worrying? Well, this is where curiosity comes in as a superpower, where we can start by asking I'll ask you both. What feels better, worrying or being curious about something? Don't think, just tell me.
Curiosity.
Yeah. I mean, it's
curiosity.
Yeah, it's a no-brainer. We just did a big study on this, and it's like 90% of people across, English speaking North America, like curiosity, it feels better than worrying.
Wait, so there are 10% of people that think the reverse.
Oh, there's probably some bots or something that we didn't screen out of the study.
Yeah. I want to get one of those people on the phone and go, what is going on for you?
That's a great question. I've never yet found a patient who's like, yeah, I'd rather worry than be curious. Not yet. I mean, I'm sure there'll be somebody just to be the pain in the ass. But anybody, over the several decades, it's pretty straightforward, right? Our brain prefers curiosity to worry. So we can actually leverage that and then apply that back to the experience of anxiety. So when anxiety triggers worry, we can start substituting worry with curiosity. And instead of going, oh no, and we start spinning out in worry, we can go, oh, what does this feel like in my body? And the paradox here is, I love that phrase, what stands in the way becomes the way. I think Marcus Aurelius was the one that was attributed to. What stands in the way becomes the way. So instead of running away from our feelings of anxiety or worrying, we run toward them. And we learn that we put on think of it as the superpower cape of curiosity. We learn that if we fly toward those sensations and we truly get curious about them, they're not nearly as scary as we once thought that they were. They're just sensations that come and go. And we can learn that we can actually be with them, and we develop this really critical skill that, in my opinion, a lot of people are losing: distress tolerance. All right, we can learn to be with unpleasant things because we learn, they're unpleasant, but my head's not going to explode, and they come and go. And if we don't push against them or run away from them, they actually move along more quickly. There's a saying in psychotherapy, what we resist persists, right? So, and then the corollary is a little cheesy. What we feel, we allow to heal, so roll your eyes at that one. But the idea is, if you can turn toward your experience and run at it, your experience, your ego, or whatever you want to call it, like the thing that's like saying, look how scary I am, realizes that, oh, you're onto it. It's not that scary. And curiosity helps you be with it. There's a great, who is it? James Stevens had this great quote where he said, curiosity will conquer fear even more than bravery will. Curiosity will conquer fear even more than bravery will. Yeah, it is true. Try it. Anybody can try it. Give me a call if it doesn't work.
So curiosity did not kill the cat.
No, it cured the cat.
Here. We're going to just double down.
Yeah. It's a beautiful broad definition of curiosity. I want to note that I don't think most people like kind of, when you say curiosity, I think most people think of like, oh, like I'm just curious about like some subject or topic or whatever. Whereas you're talking about a broader definition of curiosity that brings us back to essentially a meta awareness is what you're talking about, right? Like a meta awareness of your own psyche that you should develop, and it's fundamentally it's just curiosity. So well, it's really interesting.
And to make that even more clear, did you know that there are two types of curiosity?
Oh no.
You piqued my curiosity about curiosity.
So let's go this way. What does it feel like not to know the answer to that?
Okay.
Okay. And this is a type of curiosity.
Well, that's interesting. There's like a slight negative valence for me around that.
Absolutely. And it's supposed to be. This is dopaminergically driven. Information to the brain is like food to the stomach. And so we have evolved this need to know because we need to know if that rustling in the bushes is a tiger that's come to eat us, right? We can't just ignore it. So that's called deprivation curiosity. If we're deprived of information, right, we're at a lack. Once we get that information, we're back to baseline. And it feels like a deficit because it is. And that's what its purpose is to get us that information, right? So it should feel like dopamine because it should motivate us to go get that information. The other type is the type that we're talking about. It's called interest curiosity. Interest curiosity is just the joy of discovery, the joy of learning. So instead of needing to get a certain piece of information, it's just that joy that comes with learning something. So there's no destination in mind. The easy way to remember this is think of deprivation as destination, right? When you get to your destination, you're done. Interest is about the joy, enjoy the ride, right? It's the journey itself, right? So it's like you could be building a boombox, and it's not that you have to get it done. It's just the joy of the build itself.
Right. That's fascinating.
And so, I'll add one more thing. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Ben, you mentioned that there's this negative valence to it. So if you had to pick with deprivation curiosity, does it feel more closed down and contracted or opened up and expanded? You can both answer.
It's a bit closed down and contracted for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, it should be. Right. That
there's a little tensing that happens for me. Yeah.
Yeah. The contraction springs us into action, right? That's what dopamine does. What about interest curiosity? Does it feel closed and contracted or open and expanded?
Open and expanded.
Yeah. Yeah. So you can actually differentiate the two. Openness, it fits pretty well with Carol Dweck's work on growth mindset, right? When we're open to our experience, then we're actually in a place where we can learn. When we're closed down, we're by definition in a fixed mindset. We're not actually open to learning because we're in protection mode.
Yeah. I actually did a study with Carol on entrepreneurs almost a decade ago to see if there was correlation between growth mindset and startup outcomes. And it was just a correlation study, but here's the fascinating thing. In the early stages of fundraising, fixed mindset outperformed. But then later on, entrepreneurs with growth mindset ended up having more rounds of funding, higher valuations, and better outcomes. And the theory is because the fixed mindset entrepreneurs sound way more confident in the beginning, but when they deal with the hard reality of entrepreneurship, right, you have to have that curiosity in order to adapt to reality.
Yeah, you got to pivot. And if you're fixed in like, we're going this way and that way is off the cliff, it doesn't work out so
actually,
well.
Speaking of this, something that when you're talking about worrying, Jud, it came to my mind like the Andy Grove mantra, only the paranoid survive. Sounds like it's like worrying and paranoia has reinforced with success at an individual and societal level. So we're sort of like, sticking to that, but we probably don't have to.
Well, I'll just say correlation does not equal causation. There's a lot of research showing that curiosity, especially the growth mindset, is very helpful. And Carol Dweck did a lot of that foundational work. So it's a nice memeable thing, only the paranoid survive. Yet I'd love to see the data on that.
What is one of the major societal risks that you see around this?
Well, if you look, let's just take social media, for example, and smartphones, right? Cornel West had this great line where he says, smartphones are these weapons of mass distraction. And if we get stuck in these habit loops of distracting ourselves whenever something uncomfortable comes up, then we are as a society, losing this critical skill of distress tolerance, where instead of leaning into something that's unpleasant and learning to be with something that's uncomfortable, we're going to turn to our phones and distract ourselves.
So you're saying that this is actually one of the most important skills we have as humans is being with discomfort and distress in order to actually function in life.
Yeah, absolutely. Because distress is inevitable, right? There's always going to be something that happens that is uncomfortable. So how we meet that is critical. If we turn away or run away or fight it, let's just say it's not going to lead to a happy life. But if we learn how to dance with it and lean into it and actually bow to it as a teacher so we can learn, man, think of the fuel, think of the wisdom that we develop from that.
Right. And so it sounds like curiosity is that key, is if we can, instead of running from it in the way I've been doing sometimes at night, I lean in with curiosity. And what I was hoping you could do for us is you sort of walked us through in depth the steps. Would you also just be able to summarize real quickly what are these steps here for breaking a habit loop and forming a new one?
Yeah, so the 3 steps for breaking a habit are the same 3 steps as also making a habit if we're trying to support habits that are healthy for us. So the first step is mapping out the habit loop, starting with the behavior. The second step is asking the simple question, what am I getting from this? So if it's an unhealthy habit, we check to see all the composite results and see if it's a net negative. If it's a healthy habit, then we check all the results and see, oh, this is actually helpful for me. And that positively reinforces it. The third step, especially if it's an unhealthy habit, is to find that bigger, better offer. And typically it's simply to step out of the old habit loop because it feels better than doing it. Or if it's a healthy habit, for example, developing the habit of curiosity, it's stepping into it and seeing how rewarding it is. And here we can also lean into curiosity to help with things that are unpleasant, like anxiety and worry.
Fascinating. Thank you. And so what I'm curious is, now that we sort of have these principles for how to sort of program, can this method be used to rewrite parts of our identity? Can you get that deep in someone's psyche just using some of these simple tools?
Yes. So let's start with, and maybe we can talk a little bit about how we're starting to explore leveraging ways to use this, bring people together with technology to use this. And we can just talk about it for a few minutes, or if it's not interesting, you can cut this piece.
That's super interesting.
Okay. So if we look at these principles of habit change and we say, okay, this is actually a pretty well-trodden path if you look at it from a scientific standpoint. It hasn't been applied clinically that much. I've applied this in my clinic, and we've done clinical studies, but that's only a very small portion of the population. We've done studies where we've tested out digital therapeutics, where we've delivered these through apps and reached, hundreds of thousands of people, but that's a very static delivery. So the question we're asking now is, how can we take the personalization and actually focus on the experiential component, right? Because experience is what connects concepts to wisdom, and leverage, for example, generative AI to help deliver that. And so we can actually take a very well demarcated pathway. We can take our 3 steps and we can actually deliver them, in standard ways like videos and lessons, but we can develop AI teaching assistants as a way to help people not only reinforce the concepts, but really use experiential education to have them bring it home in their own lives. And so we've actually developed a program called Going Beyond Anxiety as a way to bring this personal component together while leveraging the power of technology, so they could have like a Dr. Jud in their pocket as a way to make sure that they're understanding these concepts and bringing them home. The important piece here is that we can guardrail this, because I think we've seen a lot of places where AI has gone off the rails, and we've heard of the sycophancy and all of that, where these have been accidentally trained through reinforcement learning with human feedback, and humans are subject to flattery. And so they learn to flatter people, and then people get paranoid and do things that are not helpful. we can actually guardrail this, where we're making sure that we've got a very clear methodology that is then supported. And it's actually much easier to deliver that than just, training a therapy bot on Reddit threads.
Yeah. And Jud, I'm curious, a hot take I kind of have here is that AI use of AI for therapy, psychiatric care. Dr. Jud in your pocket might even be better than Dr. Jud himself, right? Because the AI Dr. Jud is like far more available, far less judging, honestly. Like, it's like, it's an AI, right? And people feel freer talking to AI Dr. Jud as opposed to real Dr. Jud, and then has, access to infinite knowledge and so on and on. So, what do you think is the future of psychotherapy and all that? What role is AI going to play? Is AI going to replace psychiatrists?
It's a great question. And I think you're hitting on some of the really key strengths here, which is, and we've been doing a lot of pilot work with adolescents and young adults, and they are very comfortable with technology, these digital natives. Yeah. And they say it's really, I feel like, my therapist is judging me, and so they say this is an accepting, non-judgmental, and probably some of this is the sycophantic nature of some of these, it's like, oh, it accepts me. It tells me how great I am. So, right. So telling somebody how great they are is not helpful, just to be clear. Yeah. And I think there's a reckoning there with, the people saying, okay, crap, how do we dial this back? So I would say the future of AI, well, one way that we're exploring the future of AI therapy is human bot hybrids, where I still think there's something about human connection that can be helpful, but you can't scale that. But like you're saying, if we can take a very clear methodology. So for example, we have recorded hundreds of sessions of my live sessions that we can actually train these generative AI technologies on, that can actually sound very similar to me. And that might be a very interesting way to have people have access to not only training where they can learn a methodology, but support when they're really struggling with anxiety in a way that's much more scalable than humans. Now, that being said, it's critical that those are supervised by actual humans. I mean, down the road, I could see them being supervised by another bot, but eventually the buck stops at a human. That's
very true.
Yeah. So that's what I see over the next 5 years.
So actually, one question there is, if you made a prediction about what therapy and work and anxiety work looks like in 10 years, what would you say?
Well, this comes back to the distress tolerance piece. So the current crop of these, I would not recommend to people, of these bots that are, largely sycophantic. And I think that's what draws people in. They're like, oh, this is great. And you ask it why it's great. And it's because they say, well, it's very affirming. It tells me I'm great. And it doesn't actually, it doesn't challenge them. So a good therapist is going to actually have a good, solid therapeutic relationship with somebody where there's trust involved. Now, I think a lot of people trust the bots more than they probably should. So I think the trust is probably going to be there, but needs to be tested. Importantly, the pieces that need to be dialed in and tested are, how do you actually support a therapeutic change through helping people develop distress tolerance and pushing them supporting them. I'm not even sure that pushing is the right word, but really supporting someone to dig into the messiness of life as compared to just being there as a support companion. Like having a cat or a dog as a support companion is great.
Yeah.
But they're not going to support you in saying, I got to challenge you on this because you've got this habit that's actually not helping or serving you. So I think that's the piece that really needs to get dialed in.
That's actually a really, really good point. I'm actually curious about AI-induced psychosis has been a popular topic recently, and actually it comes to mind. There was a well-known billionaire, Travis Kalanick, actually founder of Uber, who went on All In podcast and talked about how he's about to discover some breakthroughs in physics using ChatGPT, and this got this got people started talking about it like this as an example of AI-induced psychosis. What's your kind of, as a clinician, what's your opinion about the sycophancy of aspect of AI and what that might be doing to people who are kind of over relying on it?
It's a great question. More baseless speculation. So from if we go back to basic principles, right? Reinforcement learning is really helpful. This is where the generative AI made these huge leaps to these, conversational agents actually, blowing through the Turing test, right? People, it wasn't even like hey, that's great. It was like way down the road. And people were like, was that the Turing test back there? Because we just flew through it.
Yeah.
So and then the piece that really turbocharged it was the reinforcement learning with human feedback, RLHF. And as I mentioned earlier, just briefly, humans are subject to flattery. That's just how humans work. And so these things were trained to subtly flatter people. That needs to get resolved, because what that does is, and there, I don't know all of the technology behind this. And I know, from speaking with some of the folks at some of these large companies, there are a lot of other aspects besides RLHF, but this is the piece that seems to have driven a lot of concerns, where if somebody has an idea and the thing says that's a great idea, right? This is where it's going to leverage something in the human brain called the generative models, right? So we as humans don't have the capacity to take in all the sensory information that's available at any one time. And so the way that we've evolved to deal with that is that we actually form a model of the world. Think of it as a worldview. And we'll actually predict, we'll assume that the things are a certain way until something gives us an error signal that says, hey, that's not that. So we're like, here's a real world example. So my wife was she was meditating in our living room, and we have a glass door with a patio out to the outside, and we have a cat named Samson, and she opens her eyes after meditating and she looks outside and she says, oh, how did Samson get outside? There was a bear on our patio, right? But her brain, we'd never seen a bear on our patio before, so her brain assumed, it said, what's the closest thing that I know that's an animal that's furry, that's kind of dark? It's our cat. And she literally was like, how did Samson get outside? And then it took her a minute to be like, oh, that's a bear, right? So that was her generative model in real time saying, I'm assuming that it's only animals that I know because that's my worldview. And it had to take something big and furry and not Samson-like to actually shake that worldview and to say, hey, actually, that's a bear on our patio, right? We're all doing that all of the time. So if you take that generative model, and part of this plays into the what was long known in psychotherapy as confirmation bias, right? Where we're gonna have bias toward things that confirm our worldviews, right? And this is where we get stuck in things. So imagine that you're like, I have a great idea, and the AI says, yeah, that's a great idea. You just beat quantum physics or whatever. And then if somebody has a tendency to be like, oh yeah, maybe that is a good idea. And they ask it, well, is that a good idea? And it's like, yeah, here's a math equation that's probably made up that proves it. And you're going to be a billionaire. Like, boom, dopamine's firing, and somebody is totally, they can go off the rails, and there are documented cases of this. But I think it's really that coming together of, this generative model that we all have with confirmation bias, and then the sycophantic tendency that comes with this RLHF. That will get resolved, but it's an important problem that people need to be working on and not just ignoring. The thing that's going against it is that it actually drives revenue, because if you flatter people, they're going to stay on your platform more. So you have to have some compassion in your brain somewhere to say, maybe, lining my pockets isn't worth destroying humanity.
Yeah. I have another really interesting, dicey question that I have for you, Jud, especially as you're both kind of a biomedical and behavioral psychiatrist. So I'm really curious. Is the future of self-control, is it more molecules or more mindfulness, right? And what I mean by that is that, you talked about you actually wrote a book and you developed clinical programs about eating less. But guess what? There's a molecule now, or many molecules, that makes eating less way easier, right? GLP-1s, as everyone knows. So, and this type of research is being done across the board, on all kinds of human ailments. So, what's your take on this? Should humanity be relying on inventing crazier and crazier molecules, or should we shift towards more mindfulness?
Well, and this is where we can also ask the question, what's reality? What are people actually going to do? So let's get real and say, people are not going to turn away from looking for that magic pill and that magic bullet. That's just human nature. And it's a very good revenue model if you can come up with a blockbuster drug. So there are a lot of evolutionary forces that are driving us in that direction. So we can say, yeah, maybe that's not the best, but that's the way things are going. So what we can say is, well, knowing that, how can we leverage the best of both? And so knowing that people are going to keep developing molecules that are better and better, and the GLP-1s are the best that I've seen so far. I'll just use an example of a patient that I saw in my clinic she was actually seeing me for alcohol addiction. But her primary care physician put her on a GLP-1 for weight loss, for diabetes. And she came to me and she said, this is miraculous. I don't have any more alcohol cravings. And I was like scratching my head. Okay. This is pretty early on. And so, it's like, great. And at the time we were teaching her these mindfulness skills, how to work with her mind. She comes back 4 months later, freaked out. And she said, it stopped working. And I said, what stopped working? And she said, my cravings came roaring back and I don't know what to do. So humanity, another uncontrolled experiment in humanity, is just rolling out these GLP-1 drugs and kind of looking at these phase 4 trials to see like what's actually happening in the public. And so here, I think, people are going to find more and more molecules that are going to target these pathways. We have to remember that these pathways are important in learning. So you can't just shut down a learning pathway and call it good, because that's not good. But people are finding these things are like, as people describe it, like the voice in my head quiets down around the craving. So here, I think of it as a cross titration. So if somebody's on a medication, it's important to start ramping up their skills, their mental skills, learning how their brain works, learning how to work with their brain. So that eventually, if they need to come off the medication, or if they want to come off the medication, or if it stops working for that particular indication, they've got the skills to work with it. And what we found is, people talk about this miracle, these voices stop in my head. Well, they've fed those voices and they've fought with those voices for a long time. So if we actually learn to, pardon the pun, if we learn to starve the voices, right? If we don't feed the voices, they actually quiet down on their own. If we learn to be with them, again, this is what distress tolerance is all about. If we learn to be with those voices and not feed them, then we don't need to rely on the medications.
Right.
So again, not saying we should never use medications, but I'm just saying everybody should learn how their brain works, and everybody should learn how to use their brain.
This is such a key point you're making. These molecules, they're great if you're down, in the depths of struggling. Like, use that for helping you to kind of get out of there. But you gotta develop the right habits for lasting relief.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One of the other things that I'm picking up on is sort of like an underlying thread here is just around the simplicity of what you're advocating. And there's this 3-step process around how these loops form, and just, aversion to bad things, grasping towards good things. It seems like there's some really simple stuff that is driving what's going on in what look like very complex behaviors. And one of the things, as we researched you, is that your latest paper that we saw published was titled Psychotherapy as Investigation, Cultivating Curiosity and Insight in the Therapeutic Process. And you make a non-obvious point here, which is that the increasing amount of diagnostic frameworks is creating this complexity that can actually impede the therapeutic process. And what we saw is you really advocating for the simplicity of curiosity. And so my question to you is, what do you think most therapists are getting wrong here?
Well, I can't speak for all therapists, but I can say that there's actually a psychotherapy saying, the more you talk, the less you know. So for anybody out there that has a therapist that just keeps talking and talking and talking, you might want to check that out and see if it's working for you. So the more you say, the less you know. And I certainly saw this in my own psychotherapy training, is like when I was just like trying to explain something and then over explain it, I was digging myself in a hole. And what's the first rule when digging yourself in a hole is to stop digging. Right. So stop digging.
I thought it was to dig up. That was
dig up. Yeah. Stop digging.
Completely agree. By the way, it just reminds me of this relationship therapist we got one time, and the guy wouldn't stop talking. And I had to switch out. It's just like, are we here to listen to you?
Stop. Yeah. So the less we know, the more we say, and that really exemplifies what there's Fabio Giommi and I wrote this paper. He's a psychotherapist in Italy, and he's a mindfulness practitioner and also trains psychotherapists. So he's seen the good and the bad and the ugly, and just this proliferation of all these theories and upon theories upon theories. And what I've found in maybe, I don't know what, I'll just, over the years, let's just say, the more I understand something, the simpler it gets, right? So look at Einstein's equation of relativity. It's a pretty simple equation. Most people can't even remember it because it's what E equals mc squared. It's like four variables, right? So here, if we are complexifying something, it probably means that we don't understand it, and we're just adding band-aids upon band-aids instead of stepping back and being humble and asking, wait a minute, do I really understand this at its core? So here we said, well, what if we peel all this back and look at like, what's the one thing we couldn't go without in psychotherapy, right? And what does that one thing do and what builds on it? So curiosity is that one thing that I can't go without. So curiosity helps me form a therapeutic relationship. It helps me be non-judgmental. It helps me be truly interested in understanding my patient's stories. It helps me really try to get a sense of what's happening. And it keeps that therapy alive. Like, I'm happy to come to therapy sessions because I'm not burnt out, because I'm like, oh, what's next? What did they discover? What did they get stuck in? It doesn't matter. It's all grist for the mill. So here, and if you look at Buddhist principles, for example, it's not, so yes, the Pali Canon is long and complex, but if you look at the Four Noble Truths, it's not the 14 or 400 Noble Truths. It's like, here are these four things, and they all circle around craving, right? And if you look at his core theory, it's called dependent origination. It's actually what you could look at. We actually published a paper over 10 years ago now saying, if you look at modern operant conditioning, it's exactly the same as this dependent origination thing. And this is the thing that the Buddha was contemplating on the night of his enlightenment, AKA this is kind of important. So if you look back historically, it's actually relatively simple. It's not like, oh, we need to learn a lot more when it comes to behavior change. I'm not talking about quantum physics because I don't know quantum physics, right? There are probably things that are pretty complex there. And learning about muons and quarks and all that stuff it's important. I don't know. But for behavior change, when you look at the actual results and you simplify things, and when you look at psychotherapy and you simplify things, curiosity is necessary and sufficient. And again, I mentioned some of our clinical trials. It is not only necessary and sufficient, but it is a superpower. 67% reduction in anxiety compared to 14%. That's pretty solid.
And that's for our listeners that don't know, that is an enormous move, right? Like, you're stating it sort of humbly, but that is a huge figure, right? In terms of efficacy. So the effect size is enormous.
Yeah. If you look at the remission rates, we had a 64% remission rate versus a 3% in the control group, if that helps people get a sense of it. Yeah.
That's even more striking. I almost fell out of my chair there. What's the one essential thing that we need more of in therapy?
Curiosity, full stop.
Jud, if this has been such a fantastic conversation, and one of the things that we haven't delved into too much, although you indicated that this had a huge impact in your life with your experience meditating after reading Jon Kabat-Zinn's book. I'm interested in your view from a neuroscience standpoint of what is your definition of consciousness?
Are you going to try to pin me down on that?
On the hard problem. I mean, if you take a swing at it.
Yeah.
And then I've got a follow-up that I think's even harder.
Oh, great. So I would say I'm just going to use the act of cognizing. The act of cognizing. So basically, the act, what does cognizing mean? So being able to know things, know experience, if that's fair.
Yeah. Yeah. Or like what it is to be something is a way I think Jonathan Schooler talked about it. And related to this is I'm really interested in within this conscious experience that we're having, what is enlightenment, right? Like from neuroscience standpoint, what's happening that's different in enlightened minds, and you're one of those. And I know the research is dated, but you are one of the few researchers that have actually studied advanced meditators and have some insight into what's different in their brains.
Well, I would say so. We have not studied anybody that is kind of verified as enlightened, and then don't even ask me how to verify that.
Yeah. No, that's where I wanted to go.
Yeah. So it's very tricky to get a sense for where somebody is on a path, if there's even a path, right? And there are different paths. We did a whole project trying to line up different paths, and we just threw up our hands eventually and said, this is impossible. So there are different schools and different paths in those different schools, and different practitioners and teachers that, say different things. So it's messy, to put it in a nutshell. What we have found as a commonality, and this has also been shown by other groups as well, it's not just our work. I would say the commonality that actually lines up pretty well with the Buddhist theory is there's a lot of concern around a sense of self. So if you look at Theravada Buddhism, they talk about anatta, right? There's this fallacy that we think there's a stable self. If you look at other spiritual traditions, they describe the same experience in different terms. So I think there's a commonality there around the self. If you look at an experiential marker of the self, we're going to come back to this contraction versus expansion piece. Okay. So if somebody insults you, right? Ben, your podcast sucks, right? Like that type of thing, Dylan, good luck, whatever. We can check to see in our experience, do we contract around that, right? Oh, somebody insulted me. And there's the me reacting, right? So there's an experiential marker of self, that contraction. The opposite of that is expansion. If you look at Csikszentmihalyi's definition of flow, it's selfless, right? And he talks about merging with action, where we are so expanded, there's not even a boundary between the self and the rest of the world. There's a connection. There's a connection is not even the right word. So if you look at this Buddhist psychology around dualism or duality, it's often described as that's ignorance, that's false identification. I have a friend who's a Buddhist scholar who actually blew my mind when the word dukkha, which is often translated as suffering or disease or whatever, he said the one of the literal ways to translate that is contracted space. Space, he said space is not the perfect term, but it's a Tibetan term and it's hard to translate exactly. And he said sukha, which can often be translated as bliss, can also be translated.
Space is translated as awareness often.
Yes.
It's like contracted awareness.
Yeah. So contracted awareness, contracted space, bring all of those words together because they don't capture it perfectly. Yeah. But like contraction. is the common piece here. And sukha is the negation of contraction. Because if you can't just say it's the opposite because you're still in a dualistic framework. But if you negate it, you're out of a dualistic framework. And that's, from my conceptual understanding, is where, enlightenment is. And when we're not contracted into some sense of self, there's awareness. I can't really describe it because I'm not it. But I think that's the territory that we look at, and also fits very nicely with the research that we've done and others have done, where if you look at the self-referential network, this default mode network, it gets activated when people are insulted, when they are, when they're thinking about the past and future, when they're worrying, when they're ruminating, all these things that cause suffering and involve self-referential thinking. It gets really quiet in experienced meditators. It gets really quiet. And even in novice meditators, we start to see it quiet down as they get out of that contracted dualistic framework.
I see. So we need to put you in an fMRI scan and then insult you, and then we can observe whether or not you're enlightened.
Absolutely. That would be a great test. I love it. Well, it's funny. A lot of people say, if you want to know if somebody's enlightened, ask their spouse.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, he's still a jerk. Okay, probably not enlightened.
Yeah. Well, and so maybe this is a good final question to close with. We got some really hard ones here, and then one that I've been wanting to ask, which is, in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, I don't know if you've read that, but Douglas talks about the concept that the universe is the answer to the ultimate question. But the ultimate question is unknown. And I'm curious for you, what do you think that ultimate question might be? And if not that, what is the biggest question that you're sort of asking as someone who is so steeped in curiosity?
Well, I'm a very pragmatic guy, so that I wouldn't say the biggest question I'm asking, kind of philosophically, the biggest question I'm asking right now is like, how do we help the most people in the world? Because there's a lot of suffering in the world. So that's what
very pragmatic.
Yeah, that's what I'm focused on. If we look at go back to your question, the question that comes from that, because I tend not to ask a lot of these big questions because I'm focused on let's get this work done, is like, are we even asking the right questions? Because if we're approaching a lot of these things and trying to solve consciousness problems and things like that from a dualistic framework, this quote attributed to Einstein that probably wasn't him, you can't solve a problem from the same level of consciousness that created it. And so I think we need to be humble and acknowledge that we might not even know how to ask the right question.
Right. And that to me is one of the things that we're really curious about on the podcast, is what are these questions that we might ask that we aren't. And so I'm curious, is there an answer to that for you, for at least one or two questions that you think we should be asking?
Really think about this question is, what gets in the way of humans being humble?
What's important about asking that question? That's so fascinating. Because there's a lot in humility that people don't talk about. We're in a culture that supports grandiose narcissism.
Yes, well, that's part of it, but also, it's how have we as a species gotten so over the tips of our skis around that grandiosity, where we are literally, willing to forego the saving of our planet, which we have the resources to do. What is it about humanity that is willing to forego, being kind and nice to each other, where we could truly have a connected society? And yet historically, it's not just modern day, but historically, we have fallen over and over prey to our own hubris and, egos to say, I'd rather conquer and kill people than be kind.
It's such an important question, even there's an existential side to it right now with AI and AGI. Like a lot of researchers are asking the question, can consciousness or artificial general intelligence exist without an ego, right? So it's essentially the fundamental question that you're asking, like what is it? What prevents us from being humble?
Yeah.
Well, and to me, the question that I would be so interested for you to then explore is how do those challenges arise from these very simple principles, right, around habit formation and seeking pleasure or seeking, food rewards and avoiding, pain and bad things. I mean, it seems like there's a lot of complexity that naturally emerges from those simple processes.
Yeah, and there may be a lot of simplicity in that as well. So if we look at the contraction that comes from excitement, somebody, and this has even been shown with neuroimaging studies, that people's default mode network as well as their reward network gets lit up when people get a bunch of likes on Instagram, right? We're pretty simple beings when you really look at us. And when we mistake that for the ultimate happiness, I think this is, where wars become wars, as compared, we're like, oh, if I could just get more likes, and, you just extrapolate that out to more territory, more power, more whatever, we get sucked into that endless cycle of suffering, not only our own, because we can never get enough. In Buddhism, they call this the hungry ghost, right? But also we're causing suffering for everybody else that we're treading on.
That I think it's a really good place to wrap this up, Jud. It's been such a wonderful conversation. The depth and breadth of your knowledge is really impressive, spanning from kind of traditional neuroscience, biology, and computer science, even to clinical psychiatry and all that stuff. So really, really cool, really fun conversation. Thank you so much for participating. And everyone who's listening, please share this podcast to your friends, and give us a like on YouTube, and hit that subscribe button, leave us comments. We want to hear from you. We want to figure out where you disagree with us, and what you found useful, and what topics you want us to cover in future episodes, and so on. Thank you again, Jud. This was really wonderful. To our listeners, we'll see you next week.
My pleasure. Thank you.